Another aside to help us understand modules and require: by reference and by value. When we say by reference and by value, we'll be talking about the difference between how JavaScript behaves when you pass a value to a function, whether you pass an object or a primitive. Actually, quickly, big word alert. All we mean by primitive is a type of data that represents a single value. So a number is a primitive value. A string is a primitive value. In other words, not an object. In JavaScript, it's pretty much a primitive. When we're talking about this, then, we're talking about passing a value to a function. So just using a function like you normally would, giving it a parameter. So let's say I have a primitive value, like a number or a string, and I have a variable, let's call it a. A is actually pointing to a location in memory on your computer, at a particular memory address, we call it, and that value, the actual value itself, is sitting there. So A knows where that value is in memory. When we then pass A to a function, let's say we have a function that accepts a parameter B. So we call the function and pass it A. What actually happens with the primitive value is that copy of that value, that a copy of that primitive value is created. So B points to a new location in memory, a different location in memory, that holds now a copy of that same value. This is called by value. We're passing by value. This happens naturally in JavaScript. What also happens naturally in JavaScript is that when we pass an object to a function, something very different happens. A might point to an object. Remember, an object is just a collection of name-value pairs. And it also will be sitting in a particular spot in memory. But when we call a function, we pass it to a function. That variable, that parameter inside the function, points to the same spot in memory that our original variable does. This is called pass by reference, meaning no new copy of the object is made, but it's actually two variables pointing now to the same location in memory. And so when you change one, you change the other, because it's actually the same value. Let's look at a quick example. Here in my app.js file, let's take a look at the two examples. First, we'll pass by value. I'll create a simple function called change, and it will accept a value b, and it will change b to 2. And then I'll declare a variable a that's set to 1, and then I'll call change and pass it a. And when I console.log a, what would you expect the value to be? What will be the value of a after we pass it into this function and this line is run? Well, let's take a look. I'll go to my command line and run this app.js file through Node, and I get a 1. Why? Because when change was called and this value a was passed to b, a is a primitive value. It's a number. And so b became a copy of this value. And when I changed b, it changed a different spot in memory than the spot that a is pointing at. So what happened inside the change function didn't impact a at all. Now let's look at passing by reference. Remember, JavaScript passes objects by reference. So we'll do pass by reference. We'll make a simple function called changeObj. I'll call the parameter d. And we'll assume that d is an object, and I'll change and add some properties. So d.property1, this will just be a function, it'll just be empty, and d.prop2 will be an object, let's say. Now, I'll create a C variable, which is just an empty object. And so when I call changeObj, what will happen? Well, let's say I actually even already have a prop1, and I'll make that an empty object as well. Then I'll call changeObj C and console.log C. Now, what do you expect to see when we output C? Well, it already has this property, but it's an empty object, not a function. This then takes that, overwrites what that property is, and adds a new one. So what do you expect to see when we actually log C, remembering objects are passed by reference? Well, if I run this, see that? I actually see that property has been changed to a function and a new property has been added. Why? Because when we call change object, this d value, this d parameter, this variable, points to the same memory location that c points to, because it's passed by reference. So whatever I did to d affects c, because it's the same object in memory. Node.js takes advantage of this pass by reference when it comes to objects in regards to how require and module works. So remember this. When I pass in an object, I can add properties and change properties on that object, and that will be reflected outside of the function because of pass by reference.